Thank you all for coming this evening. Really happy to have you all joining us. Tonight, we're fortunate to have the current McHarg Fellow, Emma Mendel, joining us to present some of her ongoing work and research. It's been an absolute joy having Emma here this past year. I consider myself very lucky to have been able to teach with her or co-teach with her in 501 last fall. And I feel confident that her students, many of which are in the room, feel the same way. For those of you unfamiliar with Emma, she holds a fine arts degree in graphic design from RISD, a master's of landscape architecture from the University of Toronto, and a master's of design from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Prior to joining us here at UPenn, Emma was a full-time lecturer in landscape architecture at the University of Virginia. So now with her time here at UPenn, she's achieved the kind of triple crown in landscape architecture. Emma's design work and scholarship have been exhibited and awarded internationally and include both the Venice and Chicago Biennale. She also was a previous winner of one of our LA Plus competitions that we run here at Penn in 2017. If I was forced to paraphrase Emma's work, which I guess is not, but I'm going to do, I forced myself to do, I might describe it as existing at the nexus between human settlement and hydrology, and how this relationship is mediated by various forms of knowledge creation. Moving beyond big D data, Emma's interests bring together acts of local knowledge collection and storytelling as fundamental components of a larger narrative of hydrologic infrastructure and alteration. In our collective search for respectful and creative design responses to the changing world we live in, that do not overwrite what makes places so valuable to the people that actually live there, Emma's work provides a tremendously valuable lens and methodology that I believe others should emulate. Again, it's been amazing having Emma here this past year, and I feel our program, our students, and faculty alike have benefited tremendously from her time. So with all that, I'd like to welcome Emma Mendel.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here tonight. My name is Emma Mendel, this year's Ian McHarg Fellow. I'm so thankful to Catherine and to everyone in the Landscape Architecture Department for giving me the opportunity to share my work with you today. I have had the pleasure of meeting many LART students, but for those I haven't met, it might be helpful to give a brief overview of my trajectory. I grew up in Hong Kong and first came to the States to study at Rhode Island School of Design for my undergraduate degree, as Sean just explained. But I soon discovered my interest for landscape architecture and pursued my MLA at University of Toronto after graduating from RISD. My thesis at U of T explored a set of topics that I'm still working on today, as you'll see. I delved into the issues of access to safe drinking water for First Nations communities, focusing my project on Shoal Lake 40 and Anishinaabe Reservation. Within the context of reconciliation between the First Nations and the Canadian government, my project challenged the deployment of universal and infrastructural solutions that have shaped Canada's landscape. Instead, I offered new possibilities by pairing infrastructural standards with traditional knowledge. I did this by responding to official RFPs, requests for proposals, that were looking for proposals that address the under-resourced Indigenous community. During meetings with Anishinaabe members in Toronto, we discussed water rights and their deep connection to community, land, and water. A pivotal moment in our conversations occurred when a member of the tribe expressed that there is no difference between land and water. The two are equal and hold reciprocal relationships. Land is water and water is land. This was very meaningful for me and has continued to inform how I think about the relationship between water, land, and human settlement. I continued to explore these interests in my teaching and research while I was a lecturer at University of Virginia and at Harvard GSD, where I pursued a Master's of Design Studies in Urbanism, Landscape, and Ecology. I feel so fortunate to have the opportunity to expand this research over the last 2 semesters here at Penn. As part of my ongoing research, I'm continually interested in reframing landscape architecture's relationship to Indigenous scholarship. I, of course, acknowledge that there are many scholars now working in this area. Although not situated in design, Robin Wall-Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, creates environmental teachings and critical approaches to Western mainstream science and engineering. I won't read this whole quote, but I'd like to highlight the last 2 lines. I think there is wisdom in regenerating ceremonies here, as a means to form bonds with this land. To have legacy in the world, ceremonies should be reciprocal co-creations, organic in nature, in which the community creates ceremony and the ceremony creates communities. I'm inspired by ideas like this and by books like Braiding Sweetgrass in general, but I've lately become interested in zooming out. In my research, Indigenous knowledge is one category of a broader concept, local knowledge. Communities of all different types that are small and local tend to be adaptive. They develop their own stories, local technologies, and approaches for engaging with their immediate landscape. And it is precisely the local that I have been interested in exploring more fully. This trajectory has led me to the topic that I will be sharing with you tonight, local knowledge. As expressed through a variety of cultural artifacts, local knowledge acts as infrastructure in the face of a dynamic environment. Run for the hills. This simple phrase reaches across decades and generations, directing us on how to behave in the face of an unexpected flood event. Culturally, it is as persistent as any engineering project that also attempts to protect us from risky adjacencies to water. This parallel implies that alongside technical responses to natural disasters, cultural responses are just as durable and equally necessary for us to mitigate an uncertain environment. In this lecture, I will discuss the type of knowledge that emerges after disaster events, local narratives that are created in response to them, and how they serve as what I call a cultural infrastructure. Tonight, I will briefly discuss how local stories, urban legends, and environmental folklore can act as mitigation strategies to an uncertain environment. I'd like to give an overview of my thinking and present a detailed case study. Run for the hills has become a shorthand for retreating in the face of any form of danger. But where does this phrase come from? In my research, I traced its origin back to the late 19th century, specifically to the 1889 flood of Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Importantly, it originates within a context that is of great interest to landscape architects: an extreme weather event, an infrastructural failure, and a resultant flood that destroys a water-adjacent town. Run for the hills describe the appropriate local response when facing this confluence of factors. The site of the flood, Johnstown, has a long and important history. It embodies myths of the US frontier. It contained a wealth of natural resources which led to their inevitable exploitation. It was a site of violent encounters between indigenous communities and new colonial settlers, but also an important node in the Underground Railroad, where numerous enslaved people were sheltered on their northward journeys. In the 20th century, it suffered economic downturns. It had periods of fascinating immigration and periods of unspeakable racism. Like many small towns, it is a prism that reflects the complicated issues that have defined the US: social, political, economic, and environmental. In fact, one could spend an entire career studying the multiplicity of Johnstown. But in the 2 semesters of my McHarg Fellowship, I have been looking specifically at its relationship to water and to the flood. The Johnstown flood was one of the most catastrophic in US history. It killed 2,208 people and accounted for $550 million in damages. Prior to September 11th, it was considered the single most deadly event in US history. On the surface, the flood was caused by a dam failure. This is true, but this is not the whole story. When described as a dam failure, the flood appears to be solely an engineering problem. And as a result, it can be addressed only by technical solutions. But on a deeper level, a cultural failure also caused the flood, as did competing stories about the water contained within the dam's reservoir. Over the long history of the waterway, local understandings of the water evolved. What people believed about water affected what they built in response to it. When new people encountered the dam and the reservoir, previous imaginations about its water were forgotten. People literally saw the water differently. Over time, the misalignments between these various understandings accumulated, and so did the potential for disaster. Without a shared understanding of the water, they did not see clearly the effects of what they had built, nor did they see the water's natural force. To describe the dam and its construction, I offer 4 different understandings of its water. Each captures a specific moment, and when articulated over time, they create the conditions for the Johnstown Flood. Water as resource, water as infrastructure, water as recreation, and finally, water as risk. The name, Conemac, is an English translation of the Shawnee term otter. The town is located within the floodplains of the Stony Creek and the Conemaugh River in western Pennsylvania, near large swaths of forested land and mineral resources. Delaware and Shawnee frequently passed through the nexus of these rivers and were pushed into these lands during violent battles with western frontiersmen. In 1731, Davenport and LaTorte established Conemac Old Town as the forts of the rivers. In 1769, surveyors first mapped Johnstown, and the area between the rivers began to change. 24 years later, Joseph Shantz purchased the tract, and within 6 years, Johnstown was officially established and divided into 141 lots with streets, alleys, and parks. Like many towns in western Pennsylvania, its population and urban footprint exploded during the 1800s. As the Industrial Revolution unfolded, the demand for coal, iron, and lumber necessitated more efficient transportation from sites of extraction and processing to urban markets and ports. Waterways were the primary means of transportation before the advent of railroads and automobiles. Johnstown was an important node in this process. In 1831, the canal from Johnstown to Pittsburgh opened and was known as the Western Division of the state's mainline canal system. The mainline canal system created a direct link from Philadelphia to Ohio. Its designers wanted to compete with New York's Erie Canal system, which was thriving at the time. The journey across Pennsylvania was considered more scenic. It included a ride through the first railroad tunnel and across Pittsburgh's first suspension bridge. It even included a surreal trip across aqueducts that spanned the Allegheny River. A cross-state canal system required a constant source of flowing water. Located a few miles upriver from Johnstown, the South Fork Dam was constructed in 1839 to provide a reliable water supply for this purpose. It stored an immense body of water in a reservoir that could be discharged as needed, which ensured smooth canal operations during the dry months when water from natural sources was unreliable. In 1839, engineer William Morris, no relation, made an initial sketch for the dam. Over the following 15 years, the design went through numerous iterations. Its final form was an embankment dam, approximately 918 feet wide and 72 feet high. Its outlet consisted of a spillway and a stone-lined culvert with 5 sluice valves for releasing varying amounts of flow. But constant water flow wasn't the only problem. The Allegheny Mountains were the largest obstacle for canal designers. They considered them a challenge, but not a reason to abandon the whole system. As a result, they invented numerous quirky methods for moving goods across the mountain range. At the same time, the railroad companies were also finding ways to navigate this terrain. Central Pennsylvania's Horseshoe Curve was an important moment in the story. It was a very sharp turn for locomotives, but its switchback motion allowed them to cross the Allegheny Mountains with ease. It connected eastern Pennsylvania with the west and made the canal system cumbersome by comparison. The whole canal system was deemed obsolete in the face of the new and efficient railway system. Ironically, it was discontinued a year after the South Fork Dam's completion. The dam, therefore, operated only briefly for its original intended purpose. Upriver and out of mind for many Johnstown citizens, the dam next went through many changes that would ultimately have a great effect on them. In 1875, U.S. Congressman and Pennsylvania Railroad employee John Riley bought the dam. He removed 5 drainage pipes and sold them for scrap metal. Their removal eliminated all safe methods from draining excess water and created a sag at the top of the dam, which made it susceptible for dangerous overflows. 4 years later, Riley sold the dam to the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club of Pittsburgh. They renamed the reservoir Lake Conemaugh. This change reflected its new recreational status. The club's wealthy members included many Pittsburgh industrialists, such as Andrew Carnegie, who used the reservoir for swimming, boating, fishing, and socializing. Like Riley, the dam's new owners made numerous modifications to support these new recreational activities. They lowered the dam height to a mere 4 feet above the spillway to make it more susceptible for carriage traffic. And against all logic, they installed fish screens across the spillway. At the time, fishing was a new and popular sport for wealthy gentlemen, and the industrialists could afford many expensive accessories. They filled the reservoir with 1,000 black bass from Lake Erie, which is supplied by a special train car. The fish screens they installed kept the bass from escaping downstream, but they also kept the reservoir from discharging during periods of rain. Clearly, the dam's original purpose was long forgotten at this point. As you'll recall, the dam and its reservoir were initially designed to store an immense amount of hydrostatic energy in the service of canal infrastructure. Though forgotten, this energy was still latently present, as we'll come to see. We can track the changing status of the dam and the reservoir. As we saw, the water was first a resource, then infrastructure, then recreation, and now after many modifications, engineers began to see it as a risk. They predicted that it would fail and flood the town. Their warnings, however, went unheeded. But why? First, seasonal floods was a part of Johnstown's early history. During the rainy season, the Conemaugh River often spilled into the city. This happened so frequently that it took on a local idiom. So-called pumpkin floods filled the streets with floating pumpkins that had washed downstream from indigenous upstream farms. Warnings of a flood therefore conjured images like these in the minds of local citizens. Even threats of a dam failure occurred regularly. Each spring, if the rains became unreasonably strong, engineers cautioned that the local dams could burst. They rarely did. But if they did, local citizens were hardly fazed. For example, a minor dam failure occurred in 1859 and left them wading in 3 feet of water. Therefore, when hearing the words flood and dam failure, townspeople pictured an inconvenience and not a calamity. As a result, the impending disaster was both an infrastructural failure and a failure of local cultural imagination. No one was yet inspired to run for the hills. But on the morning of May 31st, 1889, an unprecedented storm settled over western Pennsylvania, dumping 10 inches of rain into the watershed. At 3 p.m., the dam failed. The community of South Fork, just below the reservoir, watched as the dam, quote, moved away, and a deluge consumed numerous landmarks and towns downriver. Engineers estimated that the water moved through the valley with the force of Niagara Falls. It took a full hour for it to reach Johnstown. When it did, it crested 40 feet high and carried 14 miles of accumulated debris, including houses, barns, timber, train cars, oil drums, animals, and people, both dead and alive. The water rushed through the town, destroying nearly every structure it encountered. All this debris was trapped by a bridge just south of the town. It caught fire and prevented the floodwaters from draining out of the valley. This resulted in an unyielding, city-sized whirlpool of death that both drowned and burned anyone caught within it. As we can see, the collapse of the South Fork Dam and the resultant devastation was not just an infrastructural failure. It was also entangled with local culture. The stories that citizens told themselves about reservoirs, dam failures, and floods were misaligned with history, and it prevented them from seeing the natural force of water clearly. It was therefore also a failure of narrative. Physical infrastructure and cultural narratives can conspire to create a catastrophe, but they can also collaborate to prevent one. A disaster like the Johnstown flood generates numerous technical responses. Inevitably, there is an analysis of what failed, why it failed, and how it can be improved for the future. As historian Henry Petrowski writes about technical approaches, form follows failure. Johnstown was no exception. The flood informed the design of future water infrastructure throughout the country. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers enacted new policies in response to subsequent flooding in the area and counteracted it by building concrete channels in and around the city. We will return to these in a moment. More recently, papers in contemporary engineering journals still mention the Johnstown flood as an example of infrastructural failure, and sometimes use it directly as a case study. To be clear, these technical outcomes are absolutely necessary, but they are not the only important response to a disaster. There are also cultural responses. These take the form of first-hand accounts, local legends, lore, and a variety of other media. What the flood meant to people and their way of life is why the flood is important in the first place. I'm interested in how stories about the flood implicitly warn people about infrastructure and water, and how they result in types of local techne that are told, internalized, and retold. In the immediate aftermath of the flood, over 400 such stories were collected and published by James Herbert Walker as The Johnstown Horror or the Valley of Death. The book found great public interest and created a wholly new form of literature, the instant disaster genre, that described heroic accounts and fantastic descriptions of infrastructural and environmental catastrophes. Following Johnstown, other books in this new genre documented the 1900 Galveston hurricane and the San Francisco earthquake in 1906, among others. The tales fascinated readers who were hungry for sensational accounts of disasters and heroes. This genre required a new type of storytelling. Journalists would gather first-hand accounts and then extrapolate on them with previously written odds and ends that sometimes blurred fact and fiction. But as folklore historian Mark Sturgis writes, we don't read tall tales seeking evidence of actual historical events. We read them because they capture a community's emotional response to incredible features in the local landscape or extreme elements of the climate. And it is this emotional memory that persists most effectively in the minds of citizens. Similarly, in their documentary Containment, filmmakers Peter Gallison and Rob Moss highlight the importance of folktales for warning future generations about environmental danger. The Fire of Rice Sheaves, for instance, is a familiar story in Japan about retreating to higher ground during a tsunami. It is effective at reminding people about the dangers of a tsunami because it persists in children's books, songs, and annual festivals. I am proposing that we think of these stories as infrastructure. Like conventional physical infrastructure, they are stubbornly persistent throughout time. And similarly, they attempt to manage the risk of being water adjacent. As engineering, the flood translated into best practices and disappeared. But the story of the flood persisted as popular media far beyond the Valley of Death. We find it in legends, books, movies, theatrical performances, and even in cartoons. Let's look at one example.
At the Great Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C., we find the largest collection of scientific instruments in the world, used in forecasting the weather. There's the wind vane, which indicates the direction of the wind, the cup anemometer, which registers the velocity of the wind, the aneroid barometer, which registers atmospheric pressure. But out near the city of Johnstown lived a mysterious mouse named Joe, whose corns and bunions were far more accurate than all these scientific instruments. When rain threatened, his big toe would throb. When a cyclone was approaching, his second toe would react. When zero weather was just around the corner, his bunion would start to beat. On the eve of May, all was calm in the little mouse village near Johnstown. The children were safely tucked in their beds. The lights in the windows blinked out one by one, and the population settled down to a peaceful night's slumber. Joe, too, was in slumberland. But suddenly, all of his corns and bunions began to throb. Storm clouds began to gather, the lightning flashed, and the rain came down in buckets. Like the roar of a great cannon, the thunder echoed through the valley. The skies opened up in a veritable outburst, and it rained cats and dogs. Run for your lives! Young Joe, as he sprang upon a horse. Run for your lives! Run for your lives! The walls of the great dam fell, but the water rose higher and higher. The rain continued. It came down like pitchforks. Run for your lives! I told. And all at once the great dam broke. As the captain flashed the news to the one person who could see the situation.
In 1946, this episode of Mighty Mouse seems to make the same argument I am. Local knowledge is presented as more useful than engineering measurements, but it is not measured with the same seriousness. First, we see the US Weather Bureau and all the tools designed by engineers to anticipate extreme weather. These, however, are unable to warn Johnstown residents of their impending doom. It is actually the intuition of a local citizen, Old Joe's Foot, that accurately predicts the disaster and attempts to warn the town. Regardless, the dam fails, and as a result, a nuclear-powered supermouse is needed to reverse the flood and avoid the catastrophe, not so subtly arguing that atomic energy is a force for good. This is 1946 after all. Despite the obvious humor, it is interesting that 57 years after the flood, it was still fodder for a cartoon that warns us about extreme weather and the fallacy of hiding natural forces behind infrastructure. Moreover, it is interesting that the creators of Mighty Mouse themselves understood the power of folktales embodied in the character of Old Joe and his weather-predicting foot. It is interesting to note that local tales compared the force of the flood to Niagara Falls. These first-hand accounts informed a 1926 cinematic recreation of the tragedy. Director Irving Cummings used footage of the falls as a dramatic stand-in for the breached dam. And we see the memory of this flood get played out repeatedly in the public imagination of citizens in the region and beyond. It becomes a cautionary tale about the hubris of engineers and the power of nature embodied in water. On the one hand, technical infrastructure embodies the lessons of Johnstown in physical form and makes it invisible. It manages the risk of flooding while also hiding it. On the other hand, cultural infrastructure embodies the lessons of Johnstown by keeping the flood visible, by keeping it active in the imagination of citizens, the perils of dam failures, the sublime force of water, and the appropriate actions taken by people who survived. Why are cautionary tales continually needed? In this regard, Johnstown holds other lessons beyond 1889. The town flooded again in 1894, 1907, 1924, and 1936. In response, the U.S. Army Corps made numerous massive infrastructural interventions and proclaimed that the city was now, quote, flood-free. In spite of these infrastructural improvements, the city was struck with another catastrophe in 1977. 12 inches of rain fell on the area in a single day, and 6 dams failed. Combined, they unleashed 130 million gallons of water into Johnstown, causing $34 million of damage and taking the lives of 84 people. In spite of our best intentions, our technical advancements, and our modernist desires, the water always comes. My primary interests are the stories that circulate beyond the city in the water's aftermath. But there are other examples of cultural infrastructure that also emerge and keep the flood visible. They are worth exploring briefly, and I'd like to show a few examples from my site visit to Johnstown. As we might expect, the flood of 1889 is very present. But the flood of 1977 also lingers poignantly around town. On City Hall, the flood level is denoted 8 feet 6 inches. It can also be found among the foraging equipment at the Center of Metal Arts, where the datum is shown as a two-tone paint pattern. Marking floodwater lines has recently been a tactical art practice that alerts us to the perils of sea level rise. But in Johnstown, it is almost vernacular. Here's a car collision center. Like the previous examples, it reminds us of a building submerged in waters. Researching it further, it seems that this is the only branch of the company that has this color scheme. And though I don't think this particular building was actually submerged, it hardly matters. The water line becomes a local style throughout the city that reminds us of flooding in the past, but also the possible future. These water lines are more literal than the other artifacts I showed previously, but they have a similar goal. They keep the flood visible and persistent, and they caution us even if they are not explicitly instructive. As inscriptions on the city, these projects do not circulate beyond the site of the disaster. This makes them different from folktales and legends. It is hard to generalize the lessons one might learn from them. But books like the Johnstown Horror do circulate, and this is an important aspect of local tales. Returning now to the events of 1889, I'd like to show some examples from the seminar I've been teaching this semester. In this setting, I was able to learn so much about the actual flood and about the cultural artifacts that resulted from it. This semester, we explored the design of environmental folktales and speculated on how they might emerge from the Johnstown flood. The Johnstown Horror contains over 400 first-hand accounts of the flood, both facts and tall tales. With heroes, drama, and fantastic feats, each could easily serve as the starting point for local folklore. Over the semester, students analyzed several of these stories and chose one of these as the basis for a new fable about our relationship to water. Students wrote more in-depth tales that broadened the time horizon of the original story and included details about the local landscape like terrain and vegetation. In one story, a Paul Revere-like figure races down the river valley on a horse. In each town, he warns people of the flood. His route is traced on an old indigenous footpath that exists safely above the flood line. Another story describes a family of buildings that withstood the flood. They owed their survival to a sequence of mudflats that diverted the rushing waters. The students continued to expand their stories. They pushed them beyond mere accounts and turned them into fully fledged folktales. Monsoon Song by Ruth Penberthy is a tale about the bird's eye view told from the perspective of a rain-granting kestrel. In it, two communities are contrasted. The first has a sensitivity to ecology and is rewarded when they pay respect to rain. The second community has an extractive relationship to the environment. They too receive rain, but because of their terrible land use practices, the rain results in a mudslide. In Guardians of Hemlock Hill by Caroline Scholler, a stranger arrives on horseback in a small lumber town. He's a survivor of the Johnstown Flood. Observing that the town had decimated the local forests, he warns that the current rainstorm will cause a flood. When the citizens ignore his warning, he breaks into the local clock tower, rings the bell, and awakens the town. They witness the oncoming water with their own eyes. Only then do they understand and escape the flood. The story fosters a regional knowledge of deep time and the ability to think fast when one has such an awareness. The seminar led to a discussion about why folklore inscribes the landscape with memory and meaning, and thus transforms a space into a place. Paraphrasing Kent Ryden's theory of a folkloric sense of place, people invent or repeat folk legends to navigate and organize their physical geography. They use narrative to record and reinforce their versions of history. They employ folklore to strengthen their community's identity, and they share stories to articulate an emotional bond with the local landscape. Narratives revise and retell historical events. They often reveal something interesting about how local residents envision the past and their place within it. To conclude this lecture, I'd like to zoom out and bring up some larger themes that are implied by this research. If we think of folktales as cultural infrastructure and therefore a type of technology, what human knowledge and human behavior do, if we think of folktales as cultural infrastructure and therefore a type of technology, what human knowledge and human behavior do what human knowledge and human behavior do we do? I wrote this when I was half awake. Do we delegate to it? What work does it do for us? In the case of infrastructure that relates to water, how does the water done by a folktale replace the work done by a berm or levee or a dike, and vice versa? Has the work previously done by folktales now been replaced by levees? I think it's a bit of both. I'm arguing that there has always been physical and cultural infrastructure that works together in varying proportions. In earlier histories with the land, cultural infrastructure helped people navigate and exist within an uncertain environment. The Conemaugh Path, a historic indigenous trail built by Delaware, Shawnee, and Mingo tribes who hunted and gathered in the region, exists as a trail that extends from Bedford through Johnstown, then through the Conemaugh Gap in the west. Villages such as Kickenpawling were situated well above the floodplain. Today it is known as Geistown. This knowledge and behavior of living adjacent to floodplains was transmitted across generations. But these communities also invented physical infrastructure, a network of footpaths at specific elevations above the floodplain. The two systems complemented each other. In recent times, however, we have relied more heavily on physical infrastructure. We have become enamored with engineering approaches that mediate the environment on our behalf. In many cases, these advances have helped to reduce risk, but they have also diminished our intuition for living alongside water. Of course, there continue to be emergent cultural techniques that reflect our relationship to the environment. For every crisis, there is a book, a movie, a mural, a meme, but we consume them as entertainment. We no longer expect culture to teach us, to offer the moral of the story that will help us develop an environmental intuition we are lacking. Landscape architects may well be positioned to rebalance the relationship between the two. We know about engineering and physical infrastructure, but we are also sensitive to culture, to what makes a landscape meaningful. We recognize that it embodies histories, stories, and lessons. This is not to say that cultural infrastructure doesn't also fail us. Let's look again at the final scene of the Mighty Mouse cartoon. By turning back time, Mighty Mouse puts the water back in the dam and repairs it. He puts houses back into their lots and rebuilds everything as it was before. But this is the issue. To Mighty Mouse, the problem wasn't a forgotten dam that retained a tremendous amount of water. The problem was the dam failure. Mighty Mouse is essentially FEMA, or at best, the Army Corps of Engineers. Even in this story, we have an engineering mindset, an atomic mouse, a broken dam that simply needs to be repaired, and a settlement to be rebuilt just as it was. These are all engineering fantasies that might no longer be appropriate. Is this the moral of the story, to let engineers recreate the risk? If so, then culture merely reinforces a technocratic mindset. But culture can do more. It can offer us an alternative approach. It can instruct us. The real hero is not Mighty Mouse, but Old Joe and his weather-predicting foot. An increasingly uncertain environment, now caused by climate change, is again reminding us of the fragility of human society and the fallibility of technocratic thinking. And water-adjacent settlements are a front line for this renewed experience. I'm not proposing we live in fear of water, but cultural infrastructure can help instill a respect for water. It can teach us across generations that living adjacent to water is a type of risk-taking, and that when waters come, and they always do, there are ways to prepare, ways to behave, and ways to mourn when necessary. Thank you.
Do we have a mic back there? Do you know if there's questions? I don't know. Do we know if we? I don't know if there is, but you at least be able to answer the questions with the mic. Do we have time for some questions? If anyone would like to ask? I don't know.
Thank you for that. That was great. I'm wondering about Old Joe in this book. And there's something I'm reading into it, and this could just be my bias, but I'm reading into it that it's not even Old Joe, but it's his foot. That it's only a part of him, and it's like a body part, right? So there's a physical kind of bodily sensation or sign that he's then able to interpret and interpret as a warning. So I'm thinking about this also as folklore kind of broken into bits of intuition or signals and the ability to interpret them. So I'm just wondering in your research, if you come across that, especially in kind of the site visits that you have or that you did this past year, whether there's any indications of people still having some sort of bodily intuitions or some even temptation or desire to be able to interpret.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'm glad that that's the kind of, there's the bits that kind of stuck with you, that there is this kind of intuition that develops. And I think a lot of that kind of slow knowledge is what I'm really interested in, and like trying to kind of delve deeper into that. I think with this project, I visited a few other towns, and interestingly enough, speaking to kind of local folks there, it's kind of just like rules of thumb. A lot of it is like, well, we just know not to build there because that's, where the flood line was. And so they talk about it in this kind of very matter-of-fact way, but, a lot of that is this kind of embodied knowledge that is, passed down through generations. And so I think that is specifically what I'm really interested in. Those are all kind of like anecdotes, but I don't really have, it's something for me to think about further. Thanks for the question. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I don't really have a method right now. Maybe further down the line as I continue doing this research. Right now with this work, it's really just about understanding what has existed and what persists in these towns. And so a lot of the research has been focusing on that, but I think in terms of spontaneity, the act of noticing things is really powerful. And when we tap into what people notice and what people experience over a long period of time, the responses in a kind of reactive way are much more, a much richer intuition about how to respond. And so I think possibly that might be the start of the method.
So thinking about climate risk and how risk is changing as we go, have you looked into how soon narrative building is now created to
I haven't looked into that this semester, but it's a really good question. I'm gonna write that one down. It's something I want to definitely move forward with and like think about how this kind of, possibly, think about how this could be a book or an exhibition of sorts, but, definitely, I think narrative right now is a really, interesting, tool that we use in design because of exactly, what you highlighted, that climate change is kind of setting up as, very kind of tumultuous relationship with the environment. And so, yeah, definitely more food for thought. Thank you.
So I grew up in San Francisco and I grew up the earthquake narrative. Like I definitely grew up with that fear, like Loma 3899. My parents marched it out of town. Yeah, I remember like just thinking that thank God we were there. But I think there's this aspect of like fear or just this like paralyzing avoidance, at least that I grew up with. It's also similar to the fires there, like, yeah, like everybody else talks about it and we knew about it, but we didn't kind of just like open it. And so, yeah, like where does that kind of line between like collective fear versus actually like finding a way to deal with it, or like collectively experience the emotions, but in a way that's not the work?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I try to steer away from ways of solving problems, like what should we do, and focus more on just what do we do. And I think you highlighted something really interesting to me, and that's like trauma, in response to these events. And I think in all of that, there are definitely many different forms that takes, and I think that's really interesting. I right now I wouldn't be able to just off the top of my head be able to speak to the San Francisco earthquake, but it is definitely something I hope to think about moving forward.
I really appreciated the kind of graphic style and storytelling of your presentation, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you approach that for this in particular, but also how the graphics approach graphics and storytelling. How you come to that plan.
Yeah, thanks. My relationship, with this lecture, I just had a lot of fun experimenting with After Effects, and honestly, it's took a lot of maths. It comes from a little bit of the kind of simulation, simulation visual language that we see a lot in landscape architecture, and I just wanted to kind of push that a little further into some of my background in graphic design and media arts.
I'm curious if you identify in the research any narratives in contact with history as well as I'm wondering if it's taking knowledge about philosophy, but
I'm not sure I actually totally got the question.
yeah, are there any like nice things around an attitude of
I think, well, a lot of the stories in the Johnstown Flood kind of have these, either kind of heroic, tales or tales of like terrible destruction. And in that, I think the book in general, if you kind of zoom up from it, is an artifact of that kind of, just like humility for just what a flood is and what it can do to a whole society. So I think that just as a piece of artifact, is pretty interesting. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but maybe come to the final review. Look at some of the things that.
Thanks for talking, it was like really interesting. Like the 90s, when this like happened, like very different world now, right? I feel like when like disasters happen, like they seem to be a lot more, got bigger scale, more like complex. Like I think about, for example, Fukushima, other football kind of disasters like tsunami, nuclear meltdown, like earthquake. I'm just wondering, like, what do you think about how the themes you're talking about, how does that apply? Maybe, you know, in a contemporary world where these disasters are like a lot more complex, with maybe a bit more root from them potentially.
Yeah. Well, maybe you should watch the documentary Containment, because it actually speaks a lot about what you're asking. But you know, in terms of stories we tell for future generations, and what are those stories, and that's really interesting. And how do you communicate to a future generation that has yet to exist? But we know that there are warnings that we need to kind of keep persistent.
Thanks, Emma. I jotted down, you know, this incredible phrase you put up there, that the flood was a failure of cultural imagination, right? Of not being able to see or imagine the magnitude of risk. And thinking about that in terms of your conclusion, like how do we start to then imagine the risks of culture, of climate disaster, climate crisis? I think is a really great place to set this up and leave it. You know, how do we start to use the skill of design to communicate and build cultural imagination of risk that is maybe not purely apocalyptic or dystopian, but is serious enough to warrant the kind of failure around that old Joe is able to muster. So I think that both in terms of the challenge of building cultural imagination of the potential crisis and of the response. Not a question, but that's just thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. I really enjoyed hearing about your research and this approach narrative that you've developed. I guess like one thing that really strikes me about what you have been researching with cultural imagination is how it is like a decentralized response rather than like the engineering responses we've seen like very top down, often communicated by like the government or local officials. Whereas like the cultural imagination is kind of like a response of the people. So I'm I wonder like we've explored any ways that like technology like promoting the, I guess, like has that changed the way that we like develop and share personal knowledge, and are there any like relationships there? Just thinking about like decentralized networks.
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, like, I don't think we should not have technology. I think like technology does a lot for us. But at the same time, I think we depend too much on it. And oftentimes technology is positioned in a way to fail, to break. And so when that breaks, we're kind of, it's almost like a muscle, right? We're weak when we're not using it. But I think it's definitely this kind of balance that I'm trying to see how landscape architecture can kind of strike that balance between the two. But with this research, no, I didn't know, not particularly.
This was great. I want to echo Amanda's comments about your representation style, which is one, like, beautiful and very playful, and I think a nice portal into this really intense and sometimes weak word. But I also want to like maybe ask, I'm going to try to get to a question about like instrumentality and like archives. And I think setting up, you know, this like dialectic between Joe's toe and this heavy technological system of like measurement and monitoring. And also thinking about those barometric vector maps, right, as like a piece of archival material, and also thinking about the bodies of the people who survived this and perhaps their children, knowing that trauma gets encoded like in our DNA and passed on to kids, if and when we have them. I'm just curious if you could maybe think about, I'm thinking about other instances of this, right? So on the like body trauma encoding side, farm workers in California who were forced to work with short needle toes and something to like break their backs and so forth. Thinking about cobalt, say the DRC or the heavy metals, radioactive isotopes, all kinds of other things. And like what they're then asked to carry with them, kids and families. So I'm curious, if and how you're thinking about like those instruments, like the body as an instrument and an archive, and how you might start to connect this really fantastic work to maybe some other sites or events or phenomena that might, I don't know, give you other sites, other territories outside of Johnstown.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that question. It's something I think I really want to think about moving forward. I don't even know if I'm going to necessarily continue sticking with Johnstown. I probably have had enough of Johnstown for the year. I'm looking forward to looking at a different site, maybe San Francisco. But you bring up, you know, I think a set of really important topics that, like, I personally am just outside of even landscape architecture I'm interested in. So I think definitely like the idea of archives and how our body is an archive is really fascinating to think about the research. I don't know if I answered your question, but definitely, yeah.
I had one last question I could ask you. And actually came up in the question that comes in with the name today, actually, which is talking about just how long people have to live in a place before that knowledge gets encoded, like the place-based knowledge gets encoded, and how in certain places around the world, like the people that live there now are actually the ancestors of the people that have lived there forever. Where we as colonizers in this place like tended to land here at about the same time that we were putting a lot of trust in industrial like infrastructure. And so just kind of immediately disregarded any kind of like place-based or indigenous knowledge, almost by default. And so I'm just like this idea that there's this period of time, like how long someone has to like be in a place, like there's like a duration of observation or of that culture to kind of get built up, because you know, I can imagine the people in Johnstown never had, even if it was from the time they were very, very young, they never had the place-based knowledge to even just like, you know, learn to know that these things were actually possible. But if they had lived there for thousands of years, like, you know, they would have had that information. So I think it's just like an interesting idea about like how long do you have to like exist in a place to like build up this, and like where would it even have been possible, say, for example, for the people of Johnstown to have had the place-based knowledge necessary to respond to this in a more like, less this is.
Yeah.
That's my question, I guess.
No, that's really, no, I really appreciate that statement, question, yeah. Yeah, I think it's, you know, like, how do you remember without witnessing?
Yeah.
Right, and that I think is like something really, I think that's where stories and kind of oral knowledge is something that I think like passes, you know, creates an imagination for these things, and I wonder, yeah, definitely something to think about. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Emma.